what I want to talk about really, or present, is some kind of overview about the debates on the future of work. And it stems from some work that we're doing for the Joint Research Council for the European Commission. The Joint Research Council is a kind of research-led think tank for the European Commission. And we've been discussing with them, because we've been doing a big programme of work on this, what the impacts are on work and employment. But the next step is to start thinking about policy development. But the intervening step, I think, is to think about where the policy debates are at the moment, and what the positions are on technology. So, in effect, that's what I'm going to present to you. The starting position, of course, is that there is a kind of orthodoxy at the moment amongst academics and policymakers that we have entered or about to enter a fourth industrial revolution, and that there's going to be a major disruption as a consequence of it. And there are two accounts of this. One is the kind of pessimistic one, which is, oh my God, the robots are coming to take all of our jobs. And the second one says, actually, there's lots of opportunities around this. For example, to create more flexible working lives, to deal with skill shortages. And as part of that, I think, those debates, I think, have been mainly informed by what I would call kind of predictions. What we've got is a series of econometric modelling, which then predicts what will happen in the future. And my institute does a certain amount of modelling, and we know that when we do our modelling for the UK government, because we do an assessment of the labour market, it's something like to 2020, 2024, 2030, whatever. We then have to adjust because things don't quite pan out as the model predicts. But a lot of this is around the modelling, and it says this will happen, and policymakers are very concerned about this. And there was a period about 2 or 3 years ago where every time I went into the British government for a meeting, they would say, have you got any research on the robots? There is a kind of other side to this, and we'll come to this and talk to this, which is that the same kind of modelling is used to say, no, it's not a question of this will happen, this should be happening. In other words, we can use the technology, but we should be using the technology in particular ways. But actually, there's very little debate around what is actually happening. Now, in part, one might argue that's a time lag. And if you look at some of the OECD documents around this, they're talking about it takes about 5 years for the technology to actually start to kick in and be adopted more widely. But I also think it's an issue to do with data sets themselves. Considering we're talking about the future of work, and considering that Europe has got fantastic labour market and workplace data sets, there is nothing on this. We have something called the European Community Innovation Survey, which is supposed to pick these kind of things up, but it's not particularly good at doing this. So there is no big data sets around the future. But what I also want to point out, and I think this is a kind of way of framing what I'm talking about, is when we're talking about the future of work, the future of work itself is used as a very kind of catch-all term. It means lots of things. And in the States, for example, it's equated with jobs. But actually, jobs comprise both work, the processes which go into producing goods and services, and that work comprises bundles of tasks and skills. And on the other hand, there are the terms of employment under which that work occurs. Now, most obviously, in terms of the debate about the future of work, it's about contract type. Particularly around the people that are going to be employed or self-employed. But we need to disentangle the two, because if you disentangle them, we can see that in effect, there are two types of digital disruptions forecasted. There is that around production, which I think will affect paid work, and there's that around work, which will affect employment. This production is all about the clever robots. This is about artificial intelligence, machine learning, machine-to-machine communications, advanced automation, and its poster child is what developed in Germany called Industry 4.0. This is the kind of the old-style lights-out factories where robots will do everything, but the robots can speak to each other and learn. And these robots will absorb lots of the cognitive as well as physical tasks that are currently done by humans. The outcome of that, potentially, is the end of human labour, because the technology substitutes for human labour. And as a consequence of that, there have been lots of reports around how many and which jobs are about to disappear. And depending upon which model's used, some people say, Fred Osborne's very famous report talks about 47% of US jobs disappearing imminently. There are variations. The OECD talks about 35% of jobs disappearing across the OECD countries. And for the developing economies, it's even more profound, some of the modelling suggests. In China, for example, about 80% of jobs are forecast to disappear. Now, that's an awful lot of jobs quantitatively. And the reason China might be affected so badly is because they've got an awful lot of manufacturing jobs. And this kind of technology originated in manufacturing in Germany, which is why Industry 4.0 is part of the poster child. But the outcome of this, in terms of the end of paid work for humans, is potentially mass unemployment. And that's the big concern. What do you do when all these people are displaced from their job, from their paid work? The second area of disruption is around work itself. Remember, work is a series of processes producing goods and services. And what we have here are the emergence of platform companies, platforms, which act as intermediaries, brokering in the labour market between those people who request some of those tasks being done, or skills, these particular skills, and providers of those skills. And, you get kind of TaskRabbit, which is for household tasks, and then you get Uber, and Uber's the poster child for a lot of this, which is providing transport services. They claim not to be employers, but simply an app that provides connections between people. And what it effectively does is a kind of super Babbage, super Smith, break jobs down into the constituent bundle of tasks, and then they offer people the opportunity to provide those tasks for a fee. The outcome here is the end of employment, the employment relationship. People won't have an employment relationship, they'll simply contract in or be contracted to do particular tasks. The outcome there, as I say, is the outcome here is the end of human labour, the outcome here is the end of employment, which is those terms and conditions just completely disappear. So they're the two kind of major disruptions, and you can see that they have different effects, whether it's on employment or on work. And I think there are two sets of perceptions and positions on the technology itself. One is a technologically determinist position, the other understands that there are choices around the technology. And in each case, I think there are two different groups. And you can see that I like my alliterations here, but I struggle with alternativists. I don't know if I've made that up. I didn't check the Oxford English Dictionary. But I think there are two different perceptions with four different positions. The first are the advocates of the new digital technology. And this is a kind of bring it on group. And they see the technology as an opportunity. And the first of the advocates, as I'll talk about, is kind of far right, far left group. There are those who are accommodators, who see the technology as inevitable, but they recognise there's going to be real problems, there's going to have some disruptions, and what we need to do is to kind of address the problems. There are antagonists who say, no, hold on a second, what we can do is to start thinking about what we're doing and perhaps even push back against some of this technology. So they see that this sphere of new technology is contested. And then there's the fourth group, as I say, these alternativists, who actually say, no, it's a bit like this group, they're the bring it on group, they would like to see it, but see it used in a completely different way. And in terms of their policy positions, their policy responses, they've got different positions. So the advocates, the first bring it on group, on the far right, they see this technology as providing liberalisation. In other words, It allows a pure market to be created between consumers and producers. There's an app for everything, in other words. So you don't need local government to solve the cracks in the pavements, you just need an app. You will go along, and we've been visiting these places where there's these, you go along, there's a crack in the pavement, you take a photograph of it, you stick it on the app, and some contracted company out there will magically, 24 hours later, come along and resurface the pavement. You don't need government to intervene in that process. You don't need government, for example, to provide education. You can do that through MOOCs. There's a kind of far left, and this is where you can play a game with yourself to see where do you fit in this continuum. There's a far left version which is, it's not liberalisation through technology, but liberation through technology. What this one says is, let's face it, the employment relationship featured structural antagonism in which labour was always vulnerable. So if you can remove that structural antagonism and all become self-employed, the world will be a wonderful place. We will be liberated from capitalist domination. The accommodators straddle both centre-left and centre-right. There's two versions of this. I think there's a conservative version and a more radical version of the accommodators. The conservative version says, okay, we know that, for example, there are debates at the moment about whether people in the platform economy are self-employed or not. What we need to do is simply tweak the classifications, bring them into line. And that might be, for example, to create a third category status. We acknowledge that people are not really self-employed, but they're not really employees either. Maybe we should turn them into dependent contractors, which is a phrase you'll be familiar with in Australia. And as part of that, and this is part of the debates going on in the UK at the moment, at the Taylor Review, is you recognise that they're in some kind of intermediate position, and you give them a wage supplement for being casual labour. Does this sound familiar? So in the UK's position, these workers should always be paid a minimum wage, national minimum wage, it's now called national living wage, but a wage supplement to account for their vulnerabilities. But it also requires the usual kind of active labour market policies. People can be thrown out of work. So what do? We provide them with retraining, particularly digital or e-skills, though it's never quite clear what digital and e-skills are. Is it coding, or is it just digital literacy? So we give them retraining, we provide them with welfare support whilst they're in between jobs, and we also now provide them with better careers advice and guidance, which of course can be enabled through the new technology by, for example, data scraping vacancy rates, so you can see where the jobs are, which is a project we're currently looking at in my institute for Columbia. Because Columbia doesn't have labour force surveys or anything like it, they don't have any labour market information, and we're trying to do that. And of course it's incredibly, incredibly difficult. It's not as easy as people make it. But this is the kind of conservative position. I think it's a bit more of the same that we've had for the last 20 years in terms of policy. The more radical version says, okay, look, people are going to be put out of work, there's going to be less jobs around. What we need to do is to redistribute residual work. There's going to be less of it around, but share it out properly. And redesign the welfare system around that. So we have a basic, universal basic income. And that basic income is in effect to help people between jobs. And that's what Finland, for example, has been experimenting with over the last couple of years. What they also say is what we need is minimum standards, and to be able to, as part of that, increase the voice of workers in some of the discussions around the types of jobs that they have. And again, the OECD is in some respects quite progressive in this, and they're advocates, for example, of bringing trade unions into some of the discussions around this. But at a macro level. The antagonists, I think, are a bit like the old traditional left. What they say is we should push back against the platform companies through unionisation, workplace unionisation. So what we should be doing is recognising that these people are not employees, but are independent workers, and another third category label sometimes is independent contractors. We should be trying to unionise these people using exactly the same technology, the internet, to organise people. And once we've organised them, try and push for not just organisation, but representation and bargaining rights. And that's what we're seeing now in both the US and the UK, the emergence of independent workers' unions. Partly supported financially by some of the existing trade unions. And the unions are going to court to try and develop rights to bargain and rights for some of their members to have things like holiday entitlements. The other traditional position, I think, is that you push back against the platform economy. And by this, it's a recognition that the platform economy potentially is going to disrupt the old standard employment relationship, but that employment relationship is actually pretty good. It provided for decent jobs and an awful lot more for people's families. So we should be trying to reassert the standard employment relationship. And one version of this is to say these are not independent or dependent contractors, these are employees, and they should have the rights of employees, and as employers, companies like Uber should have certain responsibilities, like ensuring minimum wages, like ensuring health and safety, like ensuring holiday entitlements and sick entitlements. And another version of this is, or the kind of spin on this is, it's not just about providing standard employment relationship, but also maintaining full employment. And this is a quote from, to this effect, I think from one of your ex-ministers, Jenny Macklin, who said, first and foremost, fundamental protection for anybody is a job. And then she goes on to say, but not just any job, ones that ensure that everyone can have a decent life. So it's about making sure that there are decent jobs, decent lives, and can provide for their families. There's come across this book, Why the Future is Worthless, Dunlop, and his argument is almost a kind of back to the future position. It's about reasserting the golden age of the 1950s and the kind of traditional Fordish relationship. The alternativists, and I think these are the new left, certainly post-crisis left, they've got a very similar position on here, which is, again, the kind of bring it on thing, which is, okay, look, this technology is coming, let's maximise its use. First of all, to eradicate capitalism itself, move from a competitive platform economy to a genuine sharing economy, where all of us exchange our goods and services. And if we do that, Paul Mason says, we strip out the surplus value, capitalists can't make any money, the system collapses. Or alternatively, the digitalization of production, let the robots do all the work. It's not about freedom from the employment relationship, it's about freedom from the drudgery of work itself. So what have we got in terms of emerging policy themes? Around the two types of production, two types of disruption, we've got production and work. We're seeing the end of paid work, human paid work, the end of employment here. What we're seeing as policy responses on the whole, usually around the accommodation of antagonists, are two things. One is a redesign of welfare rights or a reaffirmation of welfare rights, but in its broadest sense, it's about active labour market policies, it's about lifelong learning, it's about training, it's about providing welfare support. Or on the other hand, in terms of end of employment, it's about labour rights. We need to move to a system where we assert labour's right to be able to push back against these kind of things. So they're the two main policy spaces at the moment that people are working in. And this one, of course, tends to be driven by unions. Not surprisingly, this one tends to be driven by governmental organisations like the European Commission and the OECD. Just very, very briefly, what's missing in this, I think, are two things. One is the kind of what I would call surveillance workplace, and the other that Zuboff has recently published on is called surveillance capitalism. Because when I said at the very beginning that work was about producing goods and services, that work can be paid and unpaid. And certainly here, in surveillance capitalism, there's an awful lot of unpaid human labour that's been harvested, behavioural data. You know, our likes, our dislikes, our digital footprints, and companies like Google and Uber increasingly are making financial gain out of it. in the past, in the 19th century, when people had ideas which created value, particularly skilled trades, they would have a share of the profits. We don't. These companies are making lots and lots of money, and the individuals who are producing that value, collectively and individually, are not being remunerated for it. At best, there's a debate about taxing them, but there's a real disconnect between reduction of the value, the capture of the value, and the distribution of value. Well, on the other hand, on surveillance capitalism, in both production and work spheres, there's an awful lot of capacity or opportunity for wearable devices, which at the moment are being organised on the basis of companies need security and don't need their workers moving around certain places. But you can use the same data for performance management in the future, collecting human data. And there's a big issue there, not around intellectual property rights, as there is here, but around human rights and rights of privacy. So one company is experimenting in the UK with chipping its employees. Stick a chip in. They'll do it because it makes their lives awful lot easier. You don't have to have the swipe cards for things. The data from that can be used. Okay, but will there be a revolution? The historical precedent, so the third industrial revolution, suggests exactly the same processes and similar prescriptions. That was in the 1970s around microchips. And if you substituted the computers are coming to take our jobs with the microchips are coming to take our jobs in the 1970s, they were exactly the same debates. And if you ever get the chance to read this book, it's called The Collapse of Work by Clive Jenkins and Barry Sherman. I bring it in not as a gratuitous prop, but that Clive Jenkins was head of a trade union at the time called the ASTMS, which Pauline Stanton was a member of. And in 1979, they wrote this, in effect, a kind of manifesto, and they said by 1984, there will have been a jobs holocaust. That's the word they used. The jobs will be wiped out. And what we need is lifelong learning, they would call it this, a version of universal basic income, and that's to stop young people revolting in the streets. It didn't happen. There's now more, and the book is focused in the UK and Europe, there are now more people in jobs in Europe and the UK than there's ever been. And in fact, in terms of government policy, we've got a cult of work, not a collapse of work. In other words, lots of work-first policies which recognise that jobs are important and we need to get people into jobs and we want them to be socially included and eradicate poverty. So we've got more people in work than ever. So nobody's worried. If you look at this data, this is from a book chapter published with Kelly and a couple of colleagues at the National Centre for Social and Economic Research in London. You can see on this side, 75% of respondents, and this is from the British Social Attitude Survey, it's a big survey, 75% of them recognise the debate, the robots are coming to take the jobs. But there's a ratio of 9-to-1 saying, yeah, they're coming, but they're not going to take my job. And there's some similar data, I think, for New Zealand. So nobody's really worried. Why aren't they worried? Well, the small empirical evidence which is beginning to emerge, and this is coming from the piece that colleague myself, Will Hunt, and Sadiq Sarkar are doing for CIPD, which is the Institute for Personnel and Development in the UK. They're concerned about where HR fit in this. And we've done a survey of senior management to ask them if they've introduced AI in their workplaces. And of those who have, what's really interesting here, I should put some red lines on it, has the introduction of the technology created any jobs in your workplace? Yeah, 43% of them say that jobs have been created in the workplaces. Has jobs been lost? Yeah, 40% companies report jobs. So as many jobs have been created in terms of workplaces as are being lost. And of those jobs which are being eliminated or replaced, those that are being eliminated or replaced, mainly lower skilled jobs and less impact on the high skilled jobs. So potentially there's some support there for the skills bias technological change thesis. Now if they are coming, jobs are going to be created, jobs are going to be lost, and there may be a general upgrading. And of the occupations in the survey which are most affected, that means jobs created, jobs lost, or jobs changed, this is really interesting outcome or finding, which completely surprised me. Divide this into work and employment. This is the group most affected, which is management and, which is professionals and high technical workers. That's the occupation in the survey which is most impacted. Jobs have 39% of jobs are becoming less, job task reports are becoming more complicated in 40% of cases, less complicated in just a short 30%, and staying the same 30%. So there's some increase in complexity of jobs, as well as de-skilling, if you like, some of the jobs. Staff reported to need more skills and knowledge by more than half, 60% of organisations. So again, kind of upgrading of knowledge and skills. Just over half, 51%, said staff had slightly or far more control over their tasks. Which is, and it's one of those things you think, really? We need to know a bit more about this. But far from the robots taking over control of jobs, at least half, it's increasing. And this is AI for both cognitive and for physical tasks. We're currently disaggregating some of the data. In terms of employment, we've got more control over working hours in 40% of organisations, well, about half. Increased no change to pay, but pay increases reported in 41%. So materially, 40% of organisations are increasing the pay, which may reflect higher skill and more control. And then the really interesting thing I thought was jobs are more secure in just over 40% of organisations, not less secure. So, why doesn't technological revolutions happen? Well, multi-level explanations. One is it's the job itself. Some jobs simply cannot be replaced. Levy and Mundane noted this before in the 1990s. Lots of jobs, and they give the example of changing a baby's diaper, which I actually think was a good example, but could you do that with a robot? I haven't gone through that process. I suggest not. But there are other things that we might want them to look after our old people, look after our kids. And then there are jobs, Rainer, for example, talks about this, where the technology has existed for a long time to have pilotless aircraft. It exists, but none of us want it. We want somebody sat behind the wheel of the plane, whether they're just watching the computers or not, we don't care, but we want somebody there. So at the job level, there are constraints. At organisational level as well, because there are costs and benefits, particularly about whether companies themselves have the IT capacity to be able to implement the technology. Whether management have got the knowledge of what exists out there. And it's very interesting in our CIPD survey, lots of managers say they've not introduced AI because they don't know much about it. And they don't really have time to find out about it. They've read the stories, but they don't know much about it. And then there are transactional costs. There's a nice case study of a German cleaning industry where they went to platform working, great, reduced costs, the cleaning was terrible. And they had no control over it, because no control of the workforce, because they claimed they weren't employees. They brought it back in-house. In terms of the business environment, I'm not usually a big reader of McKinsey reports, but actually it's a very good report that says it's to do with the state of the labour market in many cases. If you've got lots of cheap surplus labour and technology is expensive, why would you substitute it? It also relies, I think, on the labour market institutions, like the state of dialogue and the strength of dialogue between social partners, particularly trade unions. Enrique Macias has been working a lot on that. And then there's the regulation thing. And it's very, very interesting that some of the work that we've been doing around the future of work and job quality is involved in the Federation of Small Businesses. And I thought they were against regulation. Actually, in terms of Uber, the platform goes, they're for regulation because their members, the old self-employed, don't have a level playing field anymore. And there's big debates, as you probably know, across the world, in Europe particularly, about whether Uber should be allowed to operate. And it's banned in some states like Handbook in Germany. And they've lost their license in London, and they're currently appealing for all these things. And of course, there are other drivers as well, which actually might be more important than technology. Firstly, demographics. We've got an aging population and workforce. Which might mean, on the one hand, we've got a shrinking workforce, therefore we'll substitute with technology. But on the other hand, it might mean with an ageing population, we need lots of care jobs, so there'll be lots of humans looking after the ageing population, which can't be done by robots. So there might be more what Mary Gatta calls high-touch jobs, which links to what Levy and Monane talking about. Then there's globalisation itself, which, if it's interesting, if you look at the lists, and everybody seems to produce lists of jobs that are going to disappear, many of those jobs are not disappearing. They are disappearing, but they're not evaporating, they're being relocated through platform technology. So there's a very good list in the States where, you know, these jobs you should not get into because the robots are taking them. Jewellery making and IT support. It turns out these jobs are just being offshore. So the human labour will exist. The technology just allows a global talent pool. And there's a very big telecommunications company. We were talking to their chief HR manager, and he was saying they now have over 200,000 software developers. I was thinking, wow, that's fantastic. That's a huge workforce. They're not our workforce. We've just got a website where we post jobs, and 200,000 people have registered on there as potential providers, and that's global. So it might be globalization, which is driving it, rather supported by technology rather than technology itself, and then financialization. Shift in towards pursuit of shareholder value, in which non-standard employment relationship is already diminishing because the labour is seen as a disposable rather than a productive asset, and what these companies want more flexibility in their workforce, and again, they can, if necessary, they can use technology to do that, but not necessarily. So these kind of drivers may be more important than the technology itself and shape it. And Piasna and Jacobo have been arguing that actually there's no radical shift here. What we've got is continual gradual change in which the technology is intersecting and mixed up with lots of other drivers, and we're just tending to focus on the technology itself. And I think that's an important point because a lot of the debates, I think, there's the kind of technological reductionism. That's the technology that's going to drive it. Even when we look at the accommodators, OECD, the European Union, what they're trying to do is to say, let's wrap around welfare and work policies around the technology, rather than think about whether the technology should be employed in the first place, and if it is, how it might be employed in particular ways. So as I say, the main governmental policy thrust rests on accommodating digital technology, softening its edges, whether that's the loss of work or the loss of employment. We can reclassify workers, or we can provide them with some welfare support and training. And I think if you recognise that technology is not determined, that there are other options and choices, then other options and choices open up, and actually a range of futures of work potentially exist. And what we ought to be doing is looking at the big picture to say, well, what is the future that we want, and what role, if any, does technology have in them? I think we still have to recognise that's employers that are providing work, but public policy choices are possible within that, whether that's at the macro level, corporatism, social dialogue between countries, trying to organise, for example, what's very interesting about this third status reclassification system is it only makes sense if you can do it internationally, and there is a standing conference of labour statisticians who are trying to work this out at the moment and do it on a global level. It doesn't make sense if we do it in Britain, which is what we're trying to do. My institute's working at the moment to try and develop a response to the third employment status, but it does make sense if we just do it, if Germany doesn't do it, and Belgium doesn't do it, and everything else. So it's got to be coordinated at supranational level. Countries have got choices as well, particularly at regional level, because if it's manufacturing, it's going to be hit hardest with this. Some of the areas, in particular regions, which are being dependent upon manufacturing, or where the old primary industries have disappeared, and there's areas like this in the UK, and coal has been replaced by distribution centres and coal centres, those are the ones which might be more vulnerable. So you've got to think at regional level, country level, and supranational level. And I think the key issue in these policy debates that we need to think about is what are the interests that are in play here? identify what the industry is doing and how they're making decisions around the introduction and implementation of technology. And so we're trying to do this with the CIPD project, identify who makes decisions, what informs those decisions, as well as the kind of outcomes of the decision. So you've got to think about the inputs, process, and outcomes. So inputs, for example, why they might do it. Is there a demand from customers? Is it regulatory demand? Are there innovators who want to be kind of up to date with technology? One of the places we visited the other week was a paperless factory, a paperless workplace. They genuinely want to be innovative. They want to be the cutting edge of digital technology. And they even had a paperless toilet, which when we went in, of course, nobody was interested in how they work. Everybody was interested, and we stood there as a group, this fact-finding group, around the toilet to see how this paperless toilet works. That was the level of our interest. But it's about what drives them to do it, what are the processes for the implementation. And it is interesting that in the CIPD study, HR, who you might think have been at the forefront of this, are way down the decision-making chain. They're the last people who consulted on the introduction and the implementation of technology, and that may affect some of the outcomes as well. If we're not thinking about the effects on people, then people become collateral damage. If we genuinely believe that people are productive assets, then we need to think about how we can work with those. So that's the kind of mapping out of the policy positions and perceptions and approaches that's going on at the moment, I think, around digital work. And I think the next stage, as I say, will be to use this to say, okay, how do we develop effective policies, but being driven by this decision-making process rather than the technology itself. So I hope that was useful.